And what I'll do, I have to load, they're too big to put on directly on Blackboard, so I'll load them off to a YouTube, and then there'll be a little link if you want to look at it. It's mostly for people like this, but it'll be up there if you want to use it. Because I figure we'll start having people out here and there as the semester goes on. So last time I mentioned half-life, right? Half-life for anything, we can use it for radioactive decay, things like that. It's how long it takes for half of whatever the substance is to disappear. You know, if you had 10 grams in circulation, how long until there's only 5 grams left? That's half-life. Now with hormones, the reason it's important is for some hormones, again, you don't want them persisting forever for a long period of time in the blood. I think I gave the example of ADH. You know, if you're dehydrated because you haven't been drinking and you're sweating, that sort of thing, your blood's getting a little too concentrated, you're going to release ADH. That's going to cause your kidneys to reabsorb excess water from the urine, put it back in the blood, just to conserve water. That's basically what the hormone is for, to prevent your blood from getting too concentrated. But then if you go to the water fountain after class and you drink 2 gallons of water, that almost immediately goes into your blood. We don't want that ADH to still be circulating around for another hour or two, because you know, you'd be sloshing around like a boat, because you know, you're overhydrated. So you want that to be able to be shut off fairly quickly. So some hormones, you don't want them to have a real short half-life. Something like ADH, you know, once you're hydrated, you want to shut off that secretion and get rid of it pretty quickly so you don't keep reabsorbing excess water. On the other hand, some of the hormones, particularly some of the slower ones, you know, think thyroxine, I've used as an example several times. When that's released, that's for more long. You want it to persist because you want to off metabolism slowly and maintain it at a higher level, you know, as long as it's seasonally cold out. So, how long a hormone lasts in the circulation, again, it's going to vary. It depends on the hormone. Some of them, you don't want them to last long. Others, once you release them, you want them to have an effect for days, so you don't want them removed very quickly. There's one thing you can do for hormones, the main thing, to allow it to persist long. You see, what happens is when the hormones are released, there are proteins in the plasma that will destroy some of them. When a hormone diffuses out and binds to the target cell, that hormone is then degraded, typically. The liver, the kidneys will pull those hormones out of circulation and degrade them, eliminate them. So there's one important way you can make a hormone last longer if you want to. Let me draw a little diagram here. Let's just say this is your blood. Of course, this is where all the hormones end up. Draw a couple target cells out here. And so on. So let's say you have some hormones, I'll make them as little triangles here in the blood. There are 2 ways you can sort of find the hormones in the blood. They can be, let's call them free hormones. That just means there are naked hormones floating around in your blood. That's it. They're just the hormone, you know, kind of what you'd expect, I imagine. Now, with the free hormones, here's what will happen. Of course, these hormones are going to diffuse out of the blood, bind to receptors, and they'll get removed that way. If they're just floating around in the blood by themselves, that's where enzymes can degrade them, the kidney can pull them out, the liver can degrade them. So free hormones, they actually have all the action. The only ones that can affect target cells are these, what we'll call free hormones. But they're also removed quickly. So one way you'll find hormones in the blood, we'll just call them free hormones, they're unbound. The other thing you might find for some hormones, particularly those that you want to persist for a long time in the circulation, that is, you don't want them removed, you will find some plasma proteins. I used to remove these little red boxes. These are a type of globulin protein. These are specific proteins that act as carriers. So for certain hormones, thyroxine is an example, much of the thyroxine is going to be bound to one of these carrier proteins. You'll see this usually referred to as a bound hormone. So free, it's just a naked hormone floating around in the blood. If it's bound, that means it's attached to a protein, a carrier protein, type of plasma protein. Now when you have a hormone that's bound to one of these carriers, it's not going to be removed. That carrier protein protects it from any enzymes in the plasma. They're not degraded. It's not going to get pulled out by the kidney or the liver and degraded. So bound hormones would basically last forever. They last a long time. The problem with the bound hormones, because they're stuck to this big giant protein, they can't leave the blood. So if a hormone is bound one of these carrier proteins, it's not going to go anywhere. It has no activity. So what you typically have for something like thyroxine, you have sort of an equilibrium. There's a certain percentage of hormones, and it'll vary with the hormone, let's just say 10%, for the sake of argument, that are free in the plasma. The remaining hormones, let's say just 90%, a higher number, are stuck to these carrier proteins. And it's kind of an equilibrium. The bound hormones, they're going to sit there in the blood. They're not going anywhere, they're not doing anything. But these free hormones, they'll be removed by diffusing out, binding to target cells, and they'll be degraded by the kidney, the liver, and enzymes. And what happens, as you remove these free hormones, again, it's kind of the equilibrium, a certain percentage will automatically sort of break off of the carrier proteins and become free hormones, which are then free to diffuse out, attach to the receptors on target cells and cause the effect. But then again, they're also cleared quickly. So the idea is, if you want a hormone to have a short half-life, you don't want it to persist, you don't make any carrier proteins for it. They're not bound, they're all free. So as long as you're secreting them, there's going to be some in the blood. But as soon as you stop secreting them, they're very quickly removed or cleared from the system, don't have an effect. That's for something like ADH. If you want the hormone to persist longer, say like thyroxine, you produce a bunch of these specific plasma proteins that act as carriers, and a lot of the thyroxine will be carried in the blood that way. That protects it. It's not degraded. It'll last quite a bit longer, which is what you want for hormones to have a long sort of sustained effect, like thyroxine, testosterone, some of the steroids. Let's see. I think that's all we need for the general stuff. So the last, couple lectures, 3 lectures, that's been kind of the background. This is how the endocrine system works. So what we'll do now, I'm just going to run through these major glands, just kind of list the hormones. Some of them will just take a second, won't do much more than we do in the lab. A couple of them will take a little bit longer because there's a lot more interesting stuff going on. And we'll start with one we really didn't even look at in lab except for the gross anatomy. Up here in the cranium, we have the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, one of its major hormones is melatonin. Probably know some of you. What is melatonin used for? It's sold as an over-the-counter remedy a lot. It's often marketed these days as a sleep aid. This is a brain hormone. Melatonin it's released in the brain, but it targets other cells in the brain. It doesn't affect any other parts of the body, so it's kind of a signaling substance, but it's restricted to the brain. And yeah, this one, I mentioned a couple things about it. Used to be marketed for a lot of things over the counter. If you go back and you look at some late night TV, 20 years ago, they were marketing melatonin as a reproductive aid, up your libido, now they sell it as a sleep aid. One thing you have to keep in mind with all these hormones, when you're doing research on them, you can't do experimental research on humans. There's ethical things. You can't go, let's shoot this person up with melatonin and see what's happening. Let's remove the pineal gland and see what happens to them. Nah, I can't do that. So a lot of the studies are done, certainly initially, with other animals. Again, you really can't do experimentation with humans. Use the animal model first, and then occasionally you get some accidental accidents and things where you can apply it to a human and see if your work carries over and is supported. But it's often done on other mammals. And generally that works okay. If you look at most mammals, the endocrine system, we have all basically the same hormones, all do basically the same thing. But every once in a while, there are some subtle differences. If you look at melatonin, it's a hormone that's used to control, you might hear referred to as circadian rhythms or circadian rhythms, or another way to look at it, biological clocks. This hormone is used to set timed events in an organism's behavior. Now the problem with animal models is, if you look like reproduction, why do these market melatonin as reproductive aid? Because if you think of many other mammals like deer run out in our woods. When do they breed? Well, nowish, a little earlier, the last couple of months. Do deer breed in the springtime, in the summer? No, in fact, the males and females aren't even together. Most mammals have it's a timed event. Reproduction isn't random. They breed at a particular time of year, generally, at least in the evolutionary sense, so when their offspring are born, they're going to survive. You don't want to drop your offspring now in the middle of snowstorms when there's nothing to eat. That's not a good strategy. So a lot of animals are like that. Reproduction is timed. Now humans, when do we reproduce? Whenever we feel like reproducing, look at birth events, they're all over the calendar. We don't have, apparently, we don't seem to have a timing to our reproduction. It's whenever. So, melatonin probably doesn't do that much to influence the reproductive cycle in humans. Again, we don't know for certain, but it does in other animals. But what we do know in humans, because they've done all sleep studies, yeah, one event that is time is your sleep-wake pattern. If you take, they've done studies in the past where you put people in a room that is not open to the outside, and you can leave the lights on 24/7, or you can leave it dark 24/7. And if you look at people's sleeping pattern, it ends up going all over the place. You sleep 20 minutes in the middle of the day, then you wake up, then you sleep later. It's not timed anymore. You've lost that synchronization. Now for a human, at least sort of in a prehistoric sense, we don't function very well in the dark. I mean, if you go outside at night, you can't see anything. Yeah, you can see a little bit. Compared to other mammals, we're pretty much blind at night. Our senses are terrible when it's dark. And if you want to go wander around out at night, thousands of years ago, something's going to eat you. You're just bubbling around. And there you go. I'm not lying to you. So we want to be awake. When it's light out, when our receptors work, we can see things. When it's dark, crawl in the hole, go to sleep, do whatever. So sleep-wake pattern is a time event in humans. And that's where melatonin kicks in. It's often released in response to what's called photoperiod. You got the sun comes up at a particular time, stays up so many hours, depending on the season, and then it sets. That light goes into your optic nerve, into your brain, and that's basically the signal that the pineal gland uses. It'll release melatonin at a particular time so that when it's dark, you're sleepy. When it's light, you wake up. That's perfect for survival. That's also why, if you get on a plane now and you fly to the other side of the planet, the daylight cycle is all screwed up. You get what's called jet lag. That's because you're not used to sleeping, in the night at this place because they've shifted maybe 12 hours. And that's kind of what melatonin will do. For over the counter, you take a dose of that, and it kind of resets your clock to the prevailing, light dark pattern wherever you're staying. So it does have effects on timing of biological events in humans. Sleep-wake pattern is probably the best example. I think other possibilities, onset of sexual maturity, that's kind of a time event. Melatonin may have some roles there as well. So it's there to control sort of day or sleep-wake patterns and other biological events. They'll refer to them as circadian rhythms, which is just daily rhythms like sleeping and waking up, or circadian rhythms could be yearly things like reproduction in other animals, that sort of thing. Be a little careful, because like I said, a lot of the early research, it's not done on humans, and occasionally there's little things that, that didn't quite work the way we thought, and that'll happen from time to time. Pineal gland, it is a neuroendocrine gland, it is part of the brain. The reason I don't give you a slide, other than its shape, its outline, it just looks like any other group of neurons. It's not that distinctive. That's why I didn't have a slide for it. So that's the pineal, and that's its main hormone. I'm going to skip the hypothalamus for a minute, and I'll come back to it because that's going to make more sense after we look at the next gland, which is the pituitary. So let's take a minute, look at the pituitary. We've already looked at it in lab. I talked about it a little bit. Yeah, slide down here. The pituitary gland it's a two-part gland. I mentioned this in lab. This is showing you the development. Here's your embryo. This brown area here, that's actually the brain and spinal cord as it's beginning to develop. This is an embryo that's been developing about 4 weeks. And what you want to know, here's your hypothalamus here, basically. And this little bulge coming down here, what they're calling the neurohypophyseal blood. Again, I use pituitary, anterior, and posterior. Hypophysis is the same thing, just a different name. Neurohypophysis is just another name for the posterior pituitary. Adenohypophysis you might use the anterior pituitary. I won't use those terms, but you'll see them in the text and on some of the slides. So what happens here, you just get this outgrowth of the brain. That's the posterior pituitary. There it is. It is just nervous tissue. That's why you look at it on the microscope slide. It doesn't stain very heavily. There's no nuclei out there. Because really what's happening the axons, cell bodies are up in the hypothalamus, and they just grow down and terminate in the posterior pituitary. So it's really, there's not much down there except sections of axons. So the posterior pituitary is a neuroendocrine gland. It's made of nervous tissue. Those hormones could be, neurohormones. And this is just nervous tissue. Now, what's a little weird about this one, the hormones produced by the posterior pituitary, what are they? ADH, and oxytocin. Those come from the posterior pituitary. The hormones are actually synthesized in the hypothalamus. This is kind of weird. I could ask you a trick question. I won't. It wouldn't be a trick question now. But this is the only gland, the posterior pituitary, that doesn't synthesize its own hormones. The hormones are actually synthesized up here in the cell body. Then they make their way by axonal transport down to the end of the axon, and they're stored in vesicles at the end of the axon. Much like synaptic vesicles in a synapse, it's the same system. So really, if I were to ask, what hormones are synthesized by the posterior pituitary? Technically the answer is none. That's not the way I'll ask it. It's usually what hormones are secreted by the posterior pituitary. So they're temporarily stored and released in the posterior pituitary. Part of the reason we know this is some early traumatic accidents that humans had. Imagine how the steering column goes up into your oral cavity, it's going to smash. Some people have lost their posterior pituitary. If you remove this, in some cases the individuals don't lose the function of ADH and oxytocin because the axons, if they're not dead, they'll regenerate, they'll just terminate a little early, somewhere up there, and you can still get ADH and oxytocin because, again, it's not produced by the posterior pituitary. It is just temporarily stored there. Now, a little later in development, we got this isolated little posterior pituitary hanging down. This is what's going to be the embryo's oral cavity. Rathke's pouch, they sometimes call it, or just a primitive oral cavity. So that's going to be its mouth. Note this group of cells in the back of the oral cavity. They're just epithelial cells. They basically break off. They're down here somewhere. They break off, and a clump of those cells just migrates and splat right onto the posterior pituitary. Once again, in lab, that's why they look different. The anterior pituitary is more typical glandular epithelium. It's a bunch of distinct cells. They each have their own nuclei, whereas the posterior is just a bunch of axon fibers and some glial cells. Now, if we look at the hormones from either gland, I already mentioned ADH and oxytocin. I'll just list the hormones here. We'll go over them in a minute. The hormones from the anterior pituitary, there's a bunch of them. TSH is thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and so on. You can stick to different slides. I'll actually have them listed. You can read them easier than you can online. So here's what we're looking at. So here's your posterior, kind of yellow. This dark one here's the anterior. This box, oxytocin, ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, that's from the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, it's everything in this red box down here. Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, or it's also called thyrotropin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. Hence, abbreviation. We'll walk your tongue out. Let me list what the hormones do. I think I've used both of these as examples already. Oxytocin, pretty straightforward. Oxytocin, it's released from the posterior pituitary. It typically targets smooth muscle, often from the reproductive tract. So let me give you a couple of functions of oxytocin. I already mentioned one of the main ones. Oxytocin will affect the pregnant uterus. It increases the strength and force of contraction, labor contractions. That's one of its roles. It also targets the smooth muscles in the mammary glands. There's actually two hormones that will target the mammary glands. Oxytocin targets the smooth muscle in the mammaries, which causes milk letdown. That just ejects the milk. The smooth muscle helps force the milk out. Prolactin, we'll see, actually causes milk production or synthesis. The oxytocin is used for release of milk or milk letdown. And of course, what about in males? We have oxytocin. Smooth muscle and things like the vas deferens helps move the sperm along at orgasm, that sort of thing. So it's typically smooth muscle in the reproductive system is a target for oxytocin. And that's one of the hormones I gave you. It's an example of positive feedback a lot of times, which is a little unusual. Now, let me mention antidiuretic hormone. A couple things that can be a little confusing about antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Its main role under normal conditions is it's going to control blood concentration. All right. Did you look at, osmolarity, molarity, and that sort of thing last semester a little bit? Or when you look at, and I know you probably looked at tonicity, hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic, that sort of thing. All right, tonicity, makes sense, but tonicity is kind of useless. What does it mean if you have a hypertonic solution? It just means it has less water than something else, right? It's not a measure. Like it's hard to pull out a blood sample and just measure tonicity. It doesn't have that much meaning. Clinically or physiologically, they'll look at actual concentration measures. It's not a big deal. We'll go over a little bit when we do the kidney, but it's osmoles or a measure of concentration. All it is, it's a measure of the number of dissolved particles per liter. And they still use Avogadro's number. It's very similar to molarity. But just suffice it to say, this is the normal concentration of your blood. This is 300 milliosmoles. So if you pull out a blood sample, measure the plasma, it should be about 300 milliosmoles. The blood concentration, that is the ratio of solutes to water, it's one of those variables you have to maintain at a set point. Again, that's keeping your blood, your extracellular fluid, isotonic with your cells. If your blood gets too concentrated, they start sucking fluid out of the cells, the membranes shrivel up, and it'll work well. If your blood gets too dilute, that causes the cells to take on water, they swell up, maybe explode. Again, that's not so good. So blood concentration is one of those variables you have to maintain at a set point. And keep in mind, it's constantly changing. You're always losing water. I mean, even if you're not sweating, there's some nonsense or insensible loss of water through your skin. Every time you exhale, you're losing water vapor. So you're constantly losing it. Then you got your thirst, makes you drink to try and replenish it. So it's kind of a delicate balance. This is what ADH is for primarily. If your blood gets too concentrated, that is less water, more solutes, that's what will initiate the release of ADH. It primarily targets your kidneys, and it causes the kidneys to reabsorb water only. So almost, when you release ADH, it's almost like pouring distilled water into your body. I mean, you're just adding water. That's, of course, going to dilute the salts, bring down the concentration as needed. So most of the time, ADH, that's what it's used for. It's used to control blood concentration. The reason I emphasize that in a bit, maybe today, maybe next time, we'll look at another hormone. I've already mentioned it. It's aldosterone. And they both start with an A. They both target the kidney. They can be a little easy to confuse. So let me put aldosterone up here real quick. We'll get to it when we get to the adrenal gland. One of the roles we'll look at for aldosterone, particularly look at the circulatory system, blood pressure, things like that, is aldosterone will control blood volume. What happens with aldosterone when it's released from the adrenal glands, it targets the kidneys. It also makes the kidneys reabsorb water, but they reabsorb water and salt. So you see this, it almost seems like overlap. It's a little, just don't confuse them. ADH, you're just reabsorbing water. Aldosterone, water and salt. Why is that different? Well, imagine if I have a beaker of some kind of normal saline, it's got a little bit of salt in it, some solutes, and it's let's just say 300 milliosmoles. It's a certain concentration. If I put pure water into this beaker, what's going to happen for the fluid in that beaker if I pour in distilled water? It's pretty much what ADH is doing. You're going to dilute the fluid, right? Does that make sense? It's easy. Now, aldosterone, do the same thing. Let's imagine, this is your blood. It's got some dissolved solutes in there. But now you're going to pour in an isotonic solution, which is the same concentration. If I pour an isotonic solution in here, what's that going to do to the concentration? Nothing, right? It's isotonic. What's it going to change? It's just going to increase the volume of fluid. It doesn't change concentration. Does that make sense? Because it's a subtle difference, but it's important. This one is not used to control concentration. This is used to control blood volume, which, as we'll see, that affects blood pressure. You put more fluid in your circulatory system, your blood pressure goes up. Less fluid in, blood pressure goes down. So this is used to control blood volume. It does that by reabsorbing both salt and water. So you can almost think of it as reabsorbing an isotonic solution, so it's not going to change the concentration. ADH normally just reabsorbs pure water, so it's like adding distilled water. It's mainly going to affect the concentration. Does it affect the volume? Yeah, you're adding water, your blood's mostly water. But that's sort of just an unavoidable consequence. ADH's main role under normal conditions is to control blood concentration. Aldosterone's main function is to control blood volume. So it's a subtle difference, but it's important. That okay with ADH? Because I got to do one more thing. All right. So ADH, normally, blood concentration. That's what it does. But you will sometimes see another name for ADH. I don't know why they give another name. It's exactly the same chemical, comes from the same place, but you might see it called vasopressin. I won't use it. I'll just keep using ADH because it is the same chemical. But what physiologists found, ages ago, they found normally if you give a normal dose of ADH, all it does is cause you to reabsorb water. So that with the blood a bit. But at, I'm going to call it very high concentrations, ADH has a different effect. At really high doses, that is, if someone dumps enough ADH into their circulatory system, into the blood, it causes vasoconstriction of your blood vessels. See, blood vessels, of course, they move your blood around. They're just tubes, but they have muscle in them, smooth muscle. So if you take a hose and you make it smaller, what happens to the fluid flowing through that tube? It doesn't flow through as well. That's vasoconstriction. Vasodilation makes the tube get bigger. This has a huge impact on blood pressure. Just kind of give you an example. Imagine, here's your circulatory system, there's the heart. You got some blood vessels coming out, these are arteries. They go to capillary beds, we'll talk about these later, which will then drain back together into veins, and go back to the heart. See, I'm on the sideboard now, you can't see it. That's right, it's just a little thing. So of course, a little later this semester, we'll talk about blood pressure in some detail, but that's the force moving blood through your circulatory system, right? So think of blood pressure as a force pushing blood to your organs, to your lungs, that sort of thing. The lower the pressure, the less the blood flows. That means less oxygen and nutrient delivery. The higher the pressure, all else being equal, you're going to send more blood, oxygen, fluid to your tissues. So blood pressure is critical. You need some minimum amount to make sure there's enough stuff going to your tissues. But if blood pressure gets too high, your heart's overworked, your blood vessels fail, you have heart attacks, strokes, that sort of thing. Well, ADH, at very high doses, it's basically going to cause some of your arteries, particularly these smaller ones here, to constrict. That's a constriction, just like you kick a garden hose. Now think about it a minute. If I'm pumping fluid into this tube, and I kink the hose right there, what's going to happen to the pressure back here? Pump still forces it in, but it can't get out very well because of the constriction. So what do you think happens to pressure back here? It goes up. This is that's vasoconstriction. That's all I'm talking about. So if you release a large amount of ADH, it causes some of your smaller arteries to constrict. That actually boosts your blood pressure. So in an emergency, and we're talking maybe a traumatic amputation or something where you're losing a lot of blood, your blood pressure is plummeting, ADH may play a role in an emergency of boosting blood pressure temporarily by causing this vasoconstriction. I will tell you, I haven't checked any of the research recently, but there used to be some debate about this. We know if you take, blood vessels and you add enough ADH, they will constrict. Some physiologists argue the dose necessary is so high it may never happen. It's possible. But at high doses, ADH does cause vasoconstriction, which has nothing to do with blood concentration. It's a way to boost blood pressure. And that may occur in an emergency, and so they call it vasopressin. It's also called ADH, I'll just say at very high doses. That's to get you the idea that it's affecting blood vessels. All right, well, that's enough for the hormones of the posterior pituitary. There's just two. And let me look at one other thing, because as we'll see, the pituitary gland, they used to call it in some books, you'll see it referred to as the master gland, because as we'll see, there's a bunch of hormones, particularly from the anterior pituitary, that control a lot of your other endocrine glands, like the thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal hormone, FSH, LH. Those are all trophic hormones. But it turns out, as we'll see, both parts of the pituitary, both the posterior and anterior, are actually controlled by the hypothalamus. So since we've talked about the posterior in its simplest, look at that one briefly. All right, so these hormones, ADH and oxytocin, they're stored in vesicles at the end of these axons. 3 guesses what's going to make, if you look, notice they've got blue axons and red. Those are the 2 populations. The blue ones are the neurons that secrete oxytocin, the red one's ADH. What do you think causes these cells to release the hormone, either ADH or oxytocin? Remember, I think last time, there's 3 ways you can cause an endocrine gland to release its hormone. There's neurostimulation, humoral, and tropic, right? Well, just from the architecture here, you can probably guess. What do you think will cause this thing to release oxytocin? This is a nerve tract. In fact, it's called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal nerve tract. It's like, vital nerves here. This is a tract of neurons. These cells up here are neurons, and there's a synapse up here with other brain cells. If you conduct this action potential across that synapse, an action potential will move down these axons. When it reaches the end, just like in a synapse, those vesicles will release their contents, except in this case, they're hormones. So this is a neuroendocrine gland. It is stimulated by neural stimulation. There's a direct, connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So if you send action potentials down these neurons, you'll release oxytocin. You send them down these, you'll release antidiuretic hormone. And so there's sensors up in the brain, they're collecting information that determines whether they'll generate an action potential or not. Like for example, there's osmoreceptors in your brain measuring the concentration of your blood. If it gets too concentrated, an action potential is initiated, conducted down these neurons, and ADH is released. So direct nerve connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. That's how the hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary. It's just nerve impulses. It's a direct nerve tract. Now we'll look at the anterior. It's going to be a little bit different. Of course, I've already mentioned these are the 6 hormones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sometimes those change. These are the older diagrams. There's going to be a melanocyte stimulating hormone for the pituitary. We don't have that. We don't have melanocytes. But they used to list in the AMP books about 25 years ago. But these are the 6 we'll look at. Let me just run through them quickly, kind of tell you what they do. I'll use a different order. Some are more easier than others. Thyroid stimulating hormone, also called thyrotropin. I think I've used that as an example once. This one, if you know its name, you know what it does, you know its target. I mean, what's a target for thyroid stimulating hormone? The thyroid. And just be careful. I've noticed in past semesters, people confuse thyroxine and thyroid stimulating hormone. They are different from different places, do different things. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, comes from the anterior pituitary. When it's released, there's only one target for it, and that is the thyroid, and it causes growth and secretion of thyroid hormone T3, T4. Oh, pretty straightforward. So that is a tropic hormone, because what is TSH targeting? Another endocrine gland. That's our definition for a tropic hormone. Then, we'll look at this 4th one here. The next one is similar. The abbreviation is ACTH, which you want to use because its name is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, if you know its name, you can probably guess what it does. Adreno is referring to the adrenal glands. Cortico, that's the cortex of the adrenal, and it's a tropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, it targets the adrenal cortex, and it primarily causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Again, there are several different hormones in the adrenal cortex. ACTH mostly targets the adrenal cortex and causes it to release cortisol, that stress hormone that affects carbohydrate metabolism, reduces inflammation, that sort of thing. So that's also a tropic hormone. It's targeting the adrenal gland. Then let's look at prolactin. Prolactin is one of those hormones, people kind of know what it does generally before they get in here. Prolactin does what? I think I actually mentioned it earlier. This is milk production. It targets the mammary glands and causes production of milk components. Now what's kind of interesting is prolactin a tropic hormone. Again, that term tropic, it's for convenience. There's some gray areas. Your textbook will call this a tropic hormone. Now here's why. Prolactin affects the mammary glands. Are the mammary glands an endocrine gland? No. So why would you call it a tropic hormone? Well, it's not because of that effect. See, hormones have multiple effects. Prolactin, again, it's probably best known effect is it causes milk production. That's not tropic. The mammary glands aren't an endocrine gland. But do males have prolactin? Yes. We certainly are using it to stimulate milk production in our mammary glands, right? Because our mammary glands typically don't function. So what's it doing in a male when it's for milk production? It's because it has other roles. It turns out prolactin also targets the gonads. Ovaries in a female, testes in a male, and it basically sensitizes the gonads to some other hormones we'll talk about in a minute, some gonadotropic hormones. So because prolactin does have an effect on the gonads, which are endocrine glands, that's why they're referred to it as tropic. It does have some impacts on the ovaries and testes. The effect on the mammary glands is tropic. So that's prolactin, and again, usually if someone asks me what it does, say milk production, so we're good with that. But just keep in mind, it does have some effects on the gonads as well, which are endocrine glands. That's prolactin. Let's look at, I'll save those two for last. Let's do growth hormone. Well, you know, it's called growth hormone. So the guess is what it does? Growth of tissue. Yes, you are correct. Growth hormone targets tissues, particularly some of the cartilages, and it increases mitosis, cell replication. So it does cause growth. That is what it's for. And we do know if you have a growth hormone deficiency, for example, I don't know, let's say something's wrong with your pituitary, you're not secreting enough growth hormone, your adult stature will be short. You'll be a pituitary dwarf. If for some reason in childhood you start cranking out a lot of growth hormone, you know, you see those people that are like 8'4", that sort of thing, those are pituitary giants. That's due to growth hormone. Now, so it does cause growth. It's more important when you're younger. You know, you remember those epiphyseal plates in your long bones, most of your height comes from your long bones, and they have that little cartilaginous growth plate in there, right? Once that ossifies, you know, sometime after puberty, that's it. You can give me all the growth hormone you want. I'm not getting any taller. My ears will get big, you know, some of the irregular bones will get bigger, your ears get big, your tongue gets big. We don't get any taller. So this is more important in juveniles. Once you reach adult height, growth hormone has a much more minimal effect. Now, what's also interesting, with growth hormone, they have done, you know, we know what it does. You know, if you shoot someone with growth hormone, yeah, you'll get them to grow it. I mean, they use this for therapy. You know, they have experiments they've done with like mice, and they'll shoot a juvenile mouse up with a bunch of growth hormone, and the sucker gets as big as a regular rat. You know, they get huge. We'll do the same thing. You know, if they notice your growth hormone levels are low as a child, they'll supplement your growth hormone so you get to, you know, normal stature. So we know it works sort of in the body, but if you take just cell culture, you know, take some tissue, put it in a petri dish, and dump in growth hormone, you don't get much growth. Growth hormone itself, it does cause a little increase in growth mitosis, but it's pretty minimal. It's not enough to explain the change in adult height you see when you apply growth hormone to the whole body. The reason for that is they found out most of the effect of growth hormone is not direct. What happens normally, growth hormone targets, this is supposed to be the liver. One of the effects of growth hormone is it targets the liver, and it causes the liver to release something called insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. It turns out, in a petri plate, if you add the IGF, that's what explains most of the growth you get from growth hormone. The direct effect of growth hormone is pretty small, there's still some, but most of it is secondary. It's mediated through this IGF. So when growth hormone is released, it targets themselves in the liver, they release this IGF, and that's what causes most of the growth. So it's a little weird. So, that's what you need to know for this. There's a couple weird things I want to mention. Is growth hormone a tropic hormone? I don't think your book listed as a tropic hormone. It technically is. Again, that term growth, that tropic hormone term, you can make arguments either way depending on what aspect you're looking at. But remember, a tropic hormone is a hormone that targets another endocrine gland and causes it to release its hormones, right? Insulin-like, it's actually IGF. Insulin-like growth factor. Is that a hormone? Not yet. This is just the way it works. It is not listed as a hormone, but think about it. IGF It's released from the liver, it travels in the blood to distant cells, and it changes their physiology, increases the rate of mitosis. Does it fit our definition for a hormone? Yes. Is it called a hormone yet? No. This is something you'll see when they find new signaling chemicals. They will use the term factor initially. You know, when I went to grad school, there's going to be about a dozen hormones we'll look at. In my textbooks, they weren't called hormones, they were called factors. What they'll do is they'll find this substance. It seems to be a hormone, but because they're kind of conservative in the sciences, they wait until they get a bunch of information and finally go, okay, we're going to call it a hormone now. IGF, it's a hormone. It fits our definition for hormone. So this is a big if you refer to this as a hormone, then the liver is acting like an endocrine gland. Is that a trophic hormone? Yes, by our definition. The short answer is you can make an argument either way. Your textbook is not going to call growth hormone a trophic hormone because we're not considering insulin-like growth factor a hormone yet. But you know, in a textbook 5 years from now, they probably will. So growth hormone directly has some impact on growth, but it's pretty minimal. Most of the effect of growth hormone is mediated through the liver by causing the secretion of this IGF insulin-like growth factor. It's just a little weird. All right, the last two. The ones up at the top there. So for growth hormone, what's the target? You could just say the liver, that would be fine. Or if you say the epiphyseal plate, the lung bones, many tissues will respond to growth hormone. It may be indirect, but you got to think at this point, it's not quite sorted out. The last two hormones here, the top two on this list, these are collectively sometimes called gonadotropic hormones. That's just a category, it's not a specific hormone, but it's what these two are sometimes referred to sort of collectively. There are two gonadotropic hormones, and as you guess from the name, these things target the gonads. So one is FSH, the other is LH. FSH is the abbreviation for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH is luteinizing hormone. Now, a couple sort of words of warning with these. These are found in both males and females. However, they're named after what they do in the female reproductive system because that's where we found them first. So let me go over them one at a time, kind of tell you what I'll do. We'll be looking at this next week when we look at the female reproductive system. Remember all those different parts in the ovaries? I said ignore them for now. That's where this will come in. All right, follicle stimulating hormone. Of course, both of these target the gonads. In case of the female, that's ovaries, but they do different things. It turns out, if you remember, looking at an ovary, there's my ovary. If you look at an ovary under the microscope, you will see right under the surface a bunch of fairly large cells. These are the eggs, or you can use the term egg, I'm fine with it, but it's often also called oocytes. It's the same thing. What happens in the female at birth, all of the gametes, that's a general term for reproductive cells, all the eggs you're going to get are there pre-formed at birth. Females do not make any more. What you got, that's all you're going to get. And if you look at an immature ovary, one that's not at such a maturity, you will see clusters of these oocytes just along the sort of edge of the ovary. Like I said, they're there at birth. And if you pulled one out and magnified it a little bit, what you would see is a fairly large cell. Egg cells are big. Now, humans are kind of small in the egg department, but still, you can see an oocyte pretty much with your naked eye. They're usually described as being about the size of a periodic printed page. So for a cell, they're pretty big. And so if you pull one out, let's say this red thing here, this represents the oocyte or egg. And if you looked around the edge very carefully, there's a thin layer of squamous epithelial cells, which of course with our microscopes are so thin, they don't really look like anything. It's just almost like a heavy line around them. So you got the oocyte, and then there's a thin layer, single layer of squamous epithelial cells around it. That combination of the oocyte and these other ovarian cells, these squamous cells, this is what's referred to as an ovarian follicle. So at birth, you have a bunch of these follicles. They just have an oocyte with a layer of squamous cells around them. It has a specific name. This is referred to specifically as a primordial follicle. This is more or less what you're born with. You have a bunch of these, thousands of them. Primordial follicles all packed in the cortex, the outer edge of the ovary. Primordial. I'm going over this because we'll be actually doing it in the lab next week. We'll get a head start. So these are primordial follicles. They will sit there and sit there and sit there until puberty. Now, until puberty, you don't secrete any FSH. Now what's going to happen when you start to reach sexual maturity, the anterior pituitary will start releasing FSH. It's follicle stimulating hormone. It targets the follicles in the ovary. And what it will do, under the influence of FSH, the cells of this follicle will grow and change. Now, the oocyte itself doesn't do much. It may expand in size a little bit, but you don't see any change really to its structure, not with our scope. But what you will notice is those squamous cells around the oocyte, they change. They actually expand, and they move from squamous type cells to cuboidal cells. I'm trying to draw here, those are my cuboidal cells. This is really obvious under the microscope because, again, the squamous cells you can't even see. And all of a sudden, boom, you'll see this ring of cells around the oocyte. They're cuboidal in nature, not squamous anymore. You change its name. So under the influence of FSH, you will convert some of these primordial follicles into this thing here, which is called a primary. So those outer cells, eventually they're called granulosa cells, they're not part of the egg, they're actually part of the ovary, but they start to grow and proliferate. And the whole thing might get, might get a couple layers to it. Now I've got 2 layers of cuboidal cells. That's what I'm trying to draw here. This is still a primary follicle. So the idea is FSH is going to target these follicles. It's going to make them grow and mature. Eventually, more FSH, more FSH. Eventually what happens, these cells start to grow so rapidly, I can't even really draw them anymore, this thing's going to get huge. I mean, you can see these bigger follicles with your naked eye easily. You still have an oocyte in there, but eventually what happens, there's so many, I'm just drawing a squiggly line because these would be uncountable now. You get this massive number of cells in here, growing, growing, growing. And these granulosa cells, these support cells, they start getting secretory. So this whole thing swells up like a balloon. Now you have this fluid-filled ball. You got an oocyte stuck over here. This is nothing but extracellular fluid. So it'll swell up with this fluid. In lab, we'll refer to this as a fluid-filled antrum. It's just extracellular fluid. But that's what FSH does. It makes this follicle get bigger and bigger and bigger. If you're looking at it in an actual ovary, the follicle gets so big, it actually bulges the edge of the ovary out a bit. So if you could run your finger across the ovary, you feel this bulge. Well, this follicle is expanding, 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 and it's actually pushing out the edge of the ovary a bit. This is what they call a mature follicle. It's got really big, it's got fluid in it, it's got the little oocyte in there. Now, what's going to happen next? Not only do you get the FSH, which makes this follicle start growing, get secretory, start swelling up like a balloon, then you start secreting the second gonadotropic hormone, which is luteinizing hormone. The combination of luteinizing hormone and FSH make this follicle grow so quick, it's like putting a water balloon on a faucet, turning the faucet on full and holding it for a while. What happened? It explodes like a water balloon. So the combination of FSH now with the addition of LH basically causes this follicle to grow, fill with fluid faster than it can tolerate, and the whole thing just explodes. Wow, that's what they call ovulation. So LH, one of its roles, it contributes to ovulation. When this follicle ruptures, the little oocyte, it leaves the ovary. Maybe it makes way to you or you get fertilized, whatever, but that's what ovulation is. So LH has part of its impact is stimulating this follicle at the very end to basically swell up so quickly it ruptures. Then, what do you have left? Now, this ovary is literally, it's just exploded, right? That oocyte popped. Now what you have is basically a crater. sort of blown into this ovary. I mean, it just ruptured. It's kind of a rough, jagged-looking opening. At this point, LH will target the remnants of cells laying in that ruptured follicle. And what it does, it causes those cells to proliferate very rapidly, fill in this space, and you'll end up producing this really large structure as it fills in with cells. It's called the corpus luteum, which just translates to yellow body, I believe. It's just this yellowish-looking mass inside the ovary. These things are huge. I think in a human, they'll be like 2 centimeters. It's all getting close to an inch in diameter. So these things fill up very rapidly. So LH targets a ruptured follicle, causes it to develop into this corpus luteum. And as we'll see later, the corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine gland. This is where a lot of your progesterone and some of your estrogen's coming from. You also get estrogen from the follicles. We'll look at that in more detail when we get to the female reproductive system. But LH's function is to target the ruptured follicle. It makes it develop into a corpus luteum, and this is where you get much of your sex hormones, the estrogen, and the progesterone, female sex hormones. They'll come from the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone causes the ruptured follicle to fill in with cells and form what in effect is a temporary endocrine gland called the corpus luteum, which secretes a lot of the progesterones and some of the estrogens, so the female sex hormones. All right, that's what it does in a female. Now males have the same hormone. The names are all wrong. If you look in your textbook, some authors will give 2 different names for their role in a male. I don't want to have 2 different names to memorize. I still call it FSH and LH in males. It's considered acceptable. I'm not going to give it different names, but let's look at FSH. All right, in the female, follicle stimulating hormone, kind of makes sense. It stimulates the follicle, causes it, to grow and mature. I will tell you the effect in the male is sort of analogous to what it is in the female. So in the female, if FSH causes growth and maturation of the oocyte, a follicle, guess what FSH does in a male? What's a similar thing in males? Sperm production. So in both males and females, you can say FSH causes the growth and maturation of the gametes, if you want to keep it general. Gametes is just a term for sperm and eggs. It doesn't work. So in females, FSH causes growth and maturation of the follicle. In males, FSH targets those seminiferous tubules and causes or increases the production of sperm. Luteinizing hormone. One way to look at luteinizing hormone, in the female, what does it do? It basically causes the ovary to secrete the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So guess what LH does in the male? Causes the testes, the interstitial cells, to secrete testosterone. So in both cases, LH causes gonads to release the sex hormones. In females, it's estrogen and progesterone. In males, it's testosterone from the interstitial cells. So the function is analogous. I would leave the names the same. I think, for example, luteinizing hormone, I think in your textbook they might give you the name interstitial cell stimulating hormone. That's what you call it in the male. You call it LH in the female. I don't think I want to memorize 2 different names. So it's just LH in both and FSH in both. Just keep in mind the names are not really accurate for what they do in male, but that's where we'll leave it. So that is the 2 gonadotrophic hormones: follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Again, the target for both, if you want to keep it, it's the gonads. I mean, FSH and LH target ovaries or testes, depending on the sex. And that's it. So those are the hormones from the anterior pituitary. Now, the last thing we'll do with it, as I mentioned before, of course, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. So this, we looked at it earlier, for the posterior pituitary, it's pretty straightforward. How does the hypothalamus control secretion from the posterior pituitary? It's a direct nerve impulse, right nerve tract. That's easy. But now we're looking at the anterior. I will tell you the hypothalamus also controls secretions from the anterior pituitary gland. But it's going to have to be something different because there really is no connection. Remember, this anterior pituitary gland, earlier was over here, just kind of stuck on there. There's no nerve tracts connecting it. They developed in different places and just ended up in the same spot. So how can the hypothalamus control secretions from the anterior pituitary? Because it does now. All right, the answer is this gray box. There's a couple of things to keep in mind here. But the hypothalamus is also an endocrine gland. Yes, it's part of the brain, it's nervous tissue. I don't put a slide on it because it just looks like neurons. But there's a whole bunch of hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. Now these are the ones in my textbooks, 30 years ago, they didn't call these hormones. These are the hormones, they're secreted in such minute amounts. If you take a blood sample, up until fairly recently, we didn't have the technology to detect the hormones. So we didn't have a picogram per liter, really, really low concentration. Those are the ones that physiologists went to the slaughterhouse and got a bunch of hypothalamus off of, slaughtered pigs, and they ground them up and they finally extracted them enough they could identify these substances. So in my textbook, this would be called gonadotropic releasing factor. These are all called factors. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will tell you this. Every hormone we'll look at from the hypothalamus, if I ask you its target cell, the answer is anterior pituitary. That is it every time. All the hormones, all into this box, that come from the hypothalamus, so these are all hypothalamic hormones, the target is anterior pituitary for all of them. If I say anything about a hypothalamic hormone and ask what its target is, you don't have to think about it. Put down anterior pituitary. All of these hormones only target the anterior pituitary, nothing else. Now, if you know their name, for example, let's look at this is that thyrotropin. Remember, that's another name for TSH. You could call this TSH releasing hormone. So TSH releasing hormone or thyrotropin releasing hormone. I don't need to tell you what it does. What does thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone do? It targets the anterior pituitary, and guess what it makes the anterior pituitary gland do? Release thyroid stimulating hormone. And then here's another one. This will be tricky. There's another hormone in the hypothalamus. It's called prolactin releasing hormone. What does it target? Anterior pituitary. What does it make the anterior pituitary do? Release prolactin. See, these are easy. How about, this one's tricky. Prolactin inhibiting hormone comes from the hypothalamus. Guess what it targets? Anterior pituitary. What do you think it makes the anterior pituitary do? Stop releasing prolactin. If you know the name, you know what these hormones do. It's in the name. You know what the target is. It's all anterior pituitary. So these are kind of easy. You got growth hormone releasing hormone. This is actually growth hormone inhibiting hormone, but they have a different name. Gonadotropic releasing hormone. That causes the anterior pituitary to release gonadotropins, which are FSH and LH. And on down the line. So these are, if you got their name, you know what it does. They all target the same thing, anterior pituitary. So, because here's short answer question that I've asked in the past is, explain how the hypothalamus controls secretions of the pituitary gland, both posterior and anterior. Posterior is easy. There's a nerve tract there, it's direct nerve impulses, you get ADH or oxytocin, right? But then if I ask you, how does the hypothalamus control the anterior pituitary, there's actually going to be two parts to your answer. The first part is by secreting releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones, right? That's part of it. But there's a potential problem here. Go back to my lovely diagram of the circulatory system. If you look at it, really basically the circulatory system, here's your heart, it's the pump. As I mentioned before, it's going to pump blood out the arteries, and what happens, the arteries, we'll look at them later in the semester, they go out and branch, get smaller and smaller and smaller, and ultimately the arteries will split into things called capillary beds. Now what happens at a capillary bed, this is the only place where things, including hormones, can move in and out of the circulatory system. Hormones, oxygen, nutrients, they only move in and out of the circulatory system at capillary beds. So this little thing down here is a capillary bed. And once the blood is moved to a capillary bed, it goes back to the heart and gets pumped around again. It's kind of the way the circulatory system works. You pump the blood, whatever it's carrying, into the arteries, it goes down the capillary beds, things can diffuse into and out of the tissues of the capillary bed, then the blood, sort of used, comes back to the heart, gets pumped around again. Now here's a potential problem with these hormones. As I already mentioned, these hormones from the hypothalamus, they are secreted in minute concentrations, really, really small concentrations. You know how much blood is in a human body on average? It's something like 5 liters. So if I take this minuscule amount of hormone, drop it into a 5-liter bucket of fluid and shake it around a bit, the concentration's almost, it's not there. I mean, it's so small, it won't have any impact. So that's one of the problems. These hormones from the hypothalamus are released in such minute quantities. If you dump them into the general circulation and then mix it in with the 5 liters of blood that's already there, their concentration, there's not enough hormone there to affect the target cells anymore. It dilutes them way too much. The other problem, less severe, is time. It takes blood about a minute to go from the heart through the circulatory system and back to the heart. And in a situation like this, where you got something in the hypothalamus that needs to be transported to the anterior pituitary, it would take around 2 minutes to move it. Because what happens is you'd have to have a branch of the circulation This represents a capillary bed in the hypothalamus. So as the blood moves through the hypothalamus, this is where the hormone would be released, let's say thyroid stimulating hormone, releasing hormone. It moves into the blood, but then that blood has to go back to the heart, that's a minute. Then you pump that blood back out, takes about another minute before it would exit. This could be the pituitary here. Anterior pituitary. So I'm talking 2 minutes. So here's two potential problems here with these hormones. One, their concentration is too small. You can't dump them into the general circulation and mix them around in 5 liters of blood. The concentration would be insignificant. Not enough hormone there to do anything with the target cell. Second, it does take a long time. It might be 2 minutes of travel time to get that hormone from the hypothalamus into the blood, back to the heart, pump it out again to the pituitary, and let it fuse out. It's slow. It might be too slow. So there's a mechanism to fix it. So because of the normal pattern of the circulatory system, this system wouldn't work. So what happens between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, we have modified the circulatory system a little bit. We've built something called a portal system. We'll see a couple of them during the semester. I'll give you a diagram of what a portal system is. As I said, there's one in the liver called the hepatic portal system. There's one associated with the pituitary, which is called hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. But here's what a portal system is compared to normal circulation. Normally we have a heart, we go to an artery, and we go to a capillary bed, then we go to a vein, and we end up back at the heart. That's kind of what you got here. Normal circulatory pattern is artery, capillary bed, vein, back to heart. So that's all I've drawn here. What you have in a portal system, you have the heart, artery, capillary bed, vein, capillary bed, and back to the heart. So notice, you normally have artery goes into a capillary bed, drained by the vein, back to the heart. Here you have an artery goes into a capillary bed, then to a vein, another capillary bed, and then another vein. This right here, this vein, that's a portal vein. One of the ways to identify a portal vein, if you go, blood's going this direction. So if you go upstream, you hit a capillary bed. If you go downstream, you hit a capillary bed. A portal vein is between two capillary beds. That's unusual. Normal veins have a capillary bed at one end, the heart's at the other. So this thing, yeah, it's a credit card, but that is the portal vein. Notice you've got one capillary bed, they usually call it a primary capillary. And then you have a secondary. What this does, you imagine this first capillary bed, this is where the hypothalamus is. Second capillary bed, this is where the pituitary is. The volume of blood in this small portal vein in these two capillary beds is insignificant, milliliters, it's teeny. Also, the distance is so close, this moves from here to here very rapidly. Now let's look at a pretty picture that might not be big. This is what they're showing you here. These things up in yellow, these are secretory cells in the hypothalamus. It is a neuroendocrine gland. These are neurons. But those will secrete all of these. Let's say gonadotrophic releasing hormone. That's going to be released by the hypothalamus. Here's an artery coming in. This network of blood vessels here represents the primary capillary bed. So right here, as the blood moves through this capillary bed, the hypothalamic hormones will diffuse into the blood, now in the blood and the capillary. Then the blood converges or drains into a portal vein. These two things here are the portal veins. They just drop from the hypothalamus right to the pituitary stalk, into the anterior pituitary, and they split up into a secondary capillary bed where the hormone can immediately diffuse out, and then the veins will pick up the blood to take it back to circulation. So that's your hypothalamal hypophyseal portal vein. This keeps the blood volume really low, so you don't have to worry about the dilution effect, and it also keeps them pretty close together, so the amount of time isn't going to be that long. That's how the anterior pituitary controls, how the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So if I ask you that, I'm really looking for two things. How does the hypothalamus control the anterior pituitary? You got to mention something about the releasing or inhibiting hormones. That's certainly important. And the second is mention something about they're connected by this hypothalamal hypophyseal portal vein. Like I said, this is just one portal vein. There are others. The other one we look at is the hepatic portal vein, which actually connects the intestines and the liver. There's a hepatic portal vein down there. This is a big one. But all the portal veins have the same setup, capillary bed upstream and downstream. So it just allows very rapid communication from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and not a lot of dilution. So the hormones in this case, the releasing or inhibiting hormones, are still at really high concentrations here. Once they get into general circulation, that's when their concentration gets really, really low, and that's why, fairly recently, we didn't have the technology to detect them in the general circulation. Their concentration was way too tiny. All right, most of the glands will take this long. That will take care of the pituitary, both anterior and posterior, hypothalamus and pineal. Now let's do one more, there's a couple of quick ones here, so one or two, just get them out of the way. All right, well, if we're going down, so we've got everything done in the cranium. I'm going to skip the thyroid because that's going to take longer than 5 minutes. Let's just mention the thymus here real quick. I won't do any more than that than we did in lab. The thymus, it is an endocrine gland, and it's located kind of right in front of the heart. But as I mentioned in lab, this is not important in adults. In fact, it loses its function in atrophies. If you look at my thymus gland, it's basically not there. There's some fat connective tissue where it used to be. The thymus gland secretes a hormone called thymosin. It's really important to sort of mature or prime the immune system early in development. But once your immune system is primed, there's nothing else it can do, so it just degenerates. It's not needed as an adult. There, we're done with that one. And I don't put this one on the slide either because it doesn't have much look. A lot of them just look like a bunch of adipose tissue by the time we get it. But that's the thymus. Call that quits. And let's look at the parathyroids because I'll just take a second with those as well. There we go. All right. Thyroid will do next time because I want to talk about the metabolism of T3, T4, that sort of thing. What you're looking at is a posterior view. This is the thyroid gland. And here's what I mentioned. These are the parathyroids, which are embedded in the back of the thyroid gland. They don't have to be there. They just have to be the way it develops in a human. I mean, years ago, I was working with a guy named Fetty. I'm sure he's dead now because he's old time. But he was a physiologist, and he worked on dogs and chickens. And he was dissecting a chicken. I don't know what I was doing. I was like, you're right there. He's dissecting. I'm just watching. He goes, you know what that is? And I go, no. He goes, that is no. He was pointing at the thyroid gland. Chickens have a thyroid gland. And then there was this other thing way down the trachea. He was pointing at those. I have no idea it was parathyroid. Birds, you got one here, one. They don't have to be together. But the way we develop, in humans, you've got the parathyroids just embedded in the back of the thyroid. They're not the same gland. They don't functionally overlap. They just happen to be in the same spot. These are the ones we don't have any pictures in lab of our models come apart, so you can't even see them. But parathyroid glands, surprisingly enough, they secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone. So if you know the name of this gland, you better get the hormone right. It's parathyroid gland, parathyroid hormone. What does it do? Raises blood calcium. These are the ones that are important. Again, minimal blood calcium levels are necessary for the normal function of your nervous system and your heart. Those are two organs that are pretty critical. So if parathyroid hormone isn't working, you're toast pretty quick. But they, if it's calcium, give me a target organ. If you're going to affect calcium, what might be a target organ? Where do you store all your calcium? Skeletal system. You'll sacrifice bone mass to maintain blood calcium levels because you could maybe live to a broken bone. Your blood calcium goes, you're just toast. So parathyroid hormone will target, for example, the skeletal system. It'll cause you to degrade the matrix, release calcium into the blood to maintain blood calcium levels if you don't have sufficient amounts in your diet. And that one's critical. We'll look at calcitonin in the thyroid later, but that one's not as critical, and that's probably a good enough place to stop. So all we have to do next time, I have to talk about the thyroid gland a little bit, talk about the metabolism of T3, T4. We'll look at the pancreas briefly, a little bit on the adrenals. I sometimes spend a little time talking about aldosterone, and then the testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, we're kind of done. So we should wrap up endocrine system after the quiz Thursday. So quiz basically stops here. So parathyroid won't have the adrenals or the thyroid, just whatever we've covered the first 2 lectures in this one, that's what's on the quiz. I'll probably make it 11 or 12 multiple choice, and I'll put 1 short answer on there just to give you some practice and what those will be like. So I will see you up in the lab. As soon as the lab room's empty, you can head on in there. And what you can do today, I'll go over the male reproductive first. It's not a very hard system. You do have a quiz on the endocrine, most of the slides. So as you're looking through the male reproductive, if you want to pull out your slides and look at endocrine as well, I'm good with that. You know, you kind of look at whatever you think is going to suit you best in lab today after I go over it, and that'll be all right. See you in a bit.